All right, let's jump right in, shall we? Today's deep dive takes us into the truly unsettling world of Donato Bilancia, also known as the Monster of Liguria. You brought this case to my attention through a fascinating YouTube video you found from Kroniki Kryminon, a Polish true crime channel, right?
That's right, yeah.
And honestly, it's hard to even know where to begin with this one, but what really struck me was how this case, which unfolded in Italy in the late 90s, initially had authorities completely baffled. I mean, it took them quite a while to even connect the dots, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And I think what makes it so intriguing, or, well, chilling, is the sheer variety of Balancia's victims. You have
Yeah.
businessmen, you have jewelers, you have sex workers. I mean, it's just this chaotic
Yeah,
mix.
it's like, how do you even begin to make sense of that?
It's a real head scratcher, you know? And I think that's why the police initially suspected that they were dealing with multiple perpetrators. It just seemed too random.
It's totally understandable, really. It wasn't until that horrifying attack on Lorena Castro, who was a transsexual prostitute, that things started to change. That encounter, which took place in a secluded park in Barbellata, is almost like a scene ripped straight from a movie. Electric carts, security guards, a desperate fight for survival. I mean, wow.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's one of those stories that just grabs you by the throat. It's also amazing how some of those seemingly insignificant details, like the security guards patrolling on those electric carts, ended up playing a role in Castro's survival. She probably wouldn't be alive today if things had gone just a little differently.
No, she probably wouldn't. And what's truly remarkable is that Castro was able to provide such a detailed description of Bilancia, even noting a very, let's say, distinctive physical attribute, which actually played a big role in the case breaking open.
Oh, yeah, that was a key piece of the puzzle, that's for sure.
You have to wonder, though, if Bilancia even realized the magnitude of his mistake at that point. Like the media frenzy that followed, with everyone calling him the monster of Liguria. Did that notoriety fuel him somehow? Or did it, like, contribute to the seemingly erratic nature of his subsequent crimes?
That's a great question. And, you know, when I was watching that video, that thought definitely crossed my mind. I mean, it's hard to know what goes on in the mind of someone like Balancia, but it's interesting to consider how the media attention and the fact that he had become this, like, infamous figure might have impacted his psychology.
Okay, so let's delve into some of those later crimes. I mean, you have the murder of Tessie Dobo, who was found fully clothed. That kind of deviates from his usual MO, which raises questions about a possible shift in his motivations, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, up until the attack on Castro, you could argue that his crimes had a certain, how to put it, a calculated detachment, like he was focused on the robbery, on maintaining control. But once he became this public figure, the monster of Liguria, did something change in him? It's like, did his crimes become more about acting out some sort of deep-seated psychological drama? Hard to say for sure.
It is. And then you have the case of Luisa Chimino, who was murdered in her own S&M parlor. That particular detail, combined with some of the information about Balancia's own struggles with impotence and his interest in S&M, which is touched upon in the video, suggests a really complex and potentially volatile internal conflict. Like, was he seeking control in one area of his life because he felt powerless in another?
Yeah, you're hitting on some of the key points here. We have this undercurrent of possible sexual frustration, maybe a fascination with control and domination, and all of this is playing out against a backdrop of escalating violence.
It's chilling, isn't it? It's like this perfect storm is brewing and it's only going to get worse.
Unfortunately, yeah. I think you're right about that. So the police are trying to piece together this puzzle, but it's like they don't have all the pieces and they're missing the box top with the image, so they don't know what they're building. And then Bilancia commits a truly shocking act of violence, the murder of Elisabetta Zetti, who was a nurse, on a train. And I mean, it's so public, so brazen, like he's saying, I'm not afraid, I'm not hiding, I'm in control.
That's the moment, isn't it? The moment when the true terror of a serial killer comes into focus for the public. It's no longer about specific targets or isolated incidents. It's about the realization that anyone, anywhere, could be next.
I think you're right. It's that chilling randomness that makes it so terrifying.
It really is. And to think he killed again just days later, and then again this time, Maria Angela Rubino, also on a train. I can't even imagine what those final days must have been like in the Liguria region, knowing this guy was out there, seemingly unstoppable.
And sadly, both Zetti and Rubino were mothers of 4-year-old sons. Just a heartbreaking detail.
Absolutely heartbreaking. So you mentioned earlier that this is where Bilancia makes his crucial mistake.
Yeah, the Rubino murder. He leaves behind DNA evidence. I mean, up until this point, he's been incredibly careful, but this time he slips up. And for the investigators, this is the break they've been desperately waiting for.
Okay, so we have this massive police operation underway, right? Undercover officers, increased patrols, the pressure is mounting. It's a literal race against time to stop him before he kills again.
Exactly. And with everyone on high alert, Bilancia makes another mistake. He robs a gas station and kills the attendant, Giuseppe Mileto. It's the location and his MO that immediately raise red flags for the police.
Ah, okay, so things are starting to come together.
Yeah, they go back and revisit some of the earlier murders, focusing in particular on the double homicide of Maurizio Parenti and Carla Scotto.
Right, and this is where those seemingly insignificant details from earlier, like Parenti being so meticulously restrained with his own jacket sleeves cut off, suddenly take on a whole new significance, don't they?
They absolutely do. The meticulously restrained Parenti, the bypass security systems of the elderly jewelers, the almost professional precision of those currency exchange killings, it all starts to paint this picture of a very meticulous and methodical killer, someone who is in control. And then, through witness interviews connected to Parenti and Scotto, they finally get a name, Donato Bilancia.
Wow, so those early murders, the ones that seemed so random at the time, they're all starting to connect. And it's even more chilling when you consider that Bilancia actually knew Parenti personally, right?
Yeah, he did. Which adds another layer of complexity to his motives.
Absolutely. It suggests that his crimes weren't solely driven by financial gain or this hatred of security guards that we talked about before. There was something else at play here, something more personal, a thirst for revenge, perhaps. Maybe even a vendetta rooted in feelings of rejection or inadequacy stemming from his past.
Interesting thought.
So they have a suspect now, but they still need to confirm the DNA match, right?
Right. They managed to obtain some discarded items from Bilancia, cigarette butts, a coffee cup, and they run the tests, and boom, it's a match.
They finally have their man. So what happens during that initial arrest? Does Bilancia crack right away, or?
Well, surprisingly, he goes silent for 8 days. He doesn't say a word.
8 days, wow. What leads someone to a breaking point like that? And then, I mean, what does he reveal? What did he say about his motives? 8 days, huh? Just thinking about that silence is unsettling. It makes you wonder what was going on in his mind during that time. And then, after 8 days, a torrent of confessions. It's almost like a dam breaking. So what kind of picture emerges from those confessions? What do we learn about Donato Bilancia?
Well, yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Like, was it a calculated strategy? You
Yeah.
know, a way to try and control the narrative one last time? Or was it something else, maybe like a delayed psychological break? It's hard to say. But regardless, his confessions, they really do offer a glimpse into a very troubled mind. I mean, a psyche that's clearly been shaped by, well, years of trauma, insecurity, and this kind of simmering rage that ultimately boiled over into violence.
And the video does a great job of diving into Bilancia's childhood, and it's not a pretty picture. You know, he had a very strained relationship with his mother. He always felt overshadowed by his older brother, and he suffered from bedwetting well into his childhood, which, led to further humiliation and this deep sense of inadequacy. That's a lot for a young kid to deal with.
It really is. I mean, that kind of early trauma, it can have huge psychological ramifications later in life. And then, on top of all that, you have the truck accident in 1972 that left him in a coma for days. And then in 87, his brother commits suicide and tragically takes his 4-year-old son with him.
Wow, that's incredibly heavy, the loss of his brother, especially in such a horrific way. I mean, that must have been just absolutely devastating. Do you think that event specifically might have acted as some kind of catalyst, like pushing him further down this dark path?
It's impossible to say for sure, but it's definitely a possibility. I mean, loss and trauma, they can have a profound impact on a person's mental state, especially when those wounds are left, unaddressed, unhealed. And Bilancia's life seems to have been filled with these incredibly traumatic events, each one potentially contributing to this growing sense of anger, of isolation, maybe even despair.
Like a snowball effect,
Yeah.
one bad thing after another, and he just keeps spiraling further down.
Right, exactly.
And then you add in his criminal history. I mean, petty theft from a young age. He was stealing cars. He even attempted to rob a department store dressed as Santa Claus. I mean, what?
Yeah, I know. That detail always gets me. It's like, on one hand, it's kind of bizarre and almost comical, but on the other hand, it speaks to this impulsivity, this disregard for rules, and maybe even like a twisted sense of humor.
Yeah, I get it. It's one of those details that's just strange, but somehow fits. And of course, his crimes eventually escalate, and in 1981, he's convicted of armed robbery and spends 2 years in prison. So we have this progression from petty crime to more serious offenses. It makes you wonder how that prison experience might have shaped him. Did it harden him, make him more cynical, or even more prone to violence?
It's a good question. I mean, it's certainly possible that prison exposed him to a harsher side of life, that it maybe reinforced some negative patterns of behavior, or even instilled a sense of resentment towards authority figures. But I don't know if that fully explains the jump from armed robbery to serial murder.
It's a huge leap, isn't it? So what's the missing piece? What's the catalyst that transforms him from a criminal into a cold-blooded killer? And, the video touches on his struggles with impotence and his interest in S&M and suggests a possible link between these sexual complexes and his violent outbursts.
Yeah, and this is where things get really interesting from a psychological perspective. It's obviously a very sensitive topic, and we need to be careful about drawing any definitive conclusions. But the video does raise some compelling questions about the role of sexuality, specifically repressed desires and feelings of inadequacy in Bilancia's crimes.
There's definitely a pattern of control and domination that's pretty evident in his crimes. I mean, the meticulous way he subdued his victims, the weapons he chose, even the locations he selected. I mean, is it possible that this was a manifestation of his internal struggles, a way of asserting power and control in a realm where he felt powerless?
It's a chilling thought, but yeah, I think it's definitely a possibility. And it gets even more complex, even more disturbing, when you consider the fact that some of his female victims, like Alyssa Betazzetti and Maria Angela Rubino, they were mothers of young children.
That detail always gets to me. It just adds another layer of complexity, another layer of darkness to his psychological profile. Was it random, or was there a specific reason why he targeted these women?
It's hard to know for sure, but it definitely raises questions about his underlying motives. Was it some sort of twisted envy, a resentment towards those who represented stability and family life, something that he maybe craved but felt denied? Or was it something darker, a desire to inflict pain on a specific demographic, a group that he perceived as vulnerable?
Yeah, that's heavy stuff.
It is,
Yeah.
and it highlights just how difficult it is to truly unravel the mind of a serial killer. We can analyze the evidence, we can speculate about their motivations, but in the end, we're often left with more questions than answers. And this unease, this chilling reminder of the depths of human darkness.
It's a sobering thought, that someone could be capable of such horrific acts. So we have this complex picture emerging, right? A troubled childhood, traumatic experiences, a criminal past, and these unresolved sexual complexes. It's like the perfect storm of factors all converging to create a monster.
It really is. And I think it's important to remember that there's rarely a single answer, a simple explanation for how someone becomes a serial killer. It's often a combination of factors, this perfect storm of circumstances that can lead someone down a path of unimaginable darkness.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. You can see the outlines, you can make some educated guesses, but the full picture always remains just out of reach. So what happens next in Bilancia's story? He's confessed, he's been caught. What's the outcome of his trial?
Well, the trial begins in 1999, and as you can imagine, it was a huge media spectacle. And despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Bilancia remained defiant, even attempting to justify his actions.
That's unbelievable. I mean, how can someone commit such horrific acts and then try to rationalize them in court?
It's hard to fathom, isn't it?
It really is. Did he ever express any remorse, any regret for the lives he destroyed?
That's a question that continues to be debated. Some reports suggest that he did show flashes of remorse, particularly towards the families of his victims. He even wrote letters of apology, though, it's understandable that their sincerity was met with skepticism.
Yeah, I can see why. I mean, it's hard to reconcile the image of a remorseful Bilancia with the image of the cold-blooded killer who terrorized Liguria. How do you even begin to make sense of those contradictions?
It's the age-old question, right? Trying to reconcile the human with the monstrous. And it's a question that lingers even after the trial concludes and the verdict is delivered. On April 12, 2000, Donato Bilancia is sentenced to 13 life sentences, effectively ending his reign of terror.
13 life sentences. It's a heavy judgment, a way of trying to balance the scales of justice. But it also raises another question. What becomes of a man like Bilancia after such a sentence? I mean, what's life like for a monster behind bars?
And that's a great question, and that's precisely where we'll pick up in the final part of our deep dive. We'll explore Bilancia's life in prison, the psychological implications of his confinement, and the lingering questions about rehabilitation and, well, the nature of evil itself.
Okay, so here we are, the final chapter in our exploration of the monster of Liguria. Bilancia, sentenced to 13 life terms. It's hard to wrap your head around the weight of that, like What does life even become when the world shrinks down to a prison cell?
Mm.
Especially for someone like him.
It's a huge shift, that's for sure. I mean, think about it. No more control, no more manipulation, just the cold, hard reality of confinement. And, initially he was kept in solitary.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's pretty common practice for, high-profile criminals, especially those deemed dangerous.
Right. Right. Well, that makes sense, I guess. But you have to wonder about the psychological effects of that kind of isolation.
Mm.
I mean, this is a man who seemed driven by a need for control, for power over others, and then, bam, suddenly he's stripped of all autonomy. That must have been a pretty jarring experience, to say the least.
Absolutely. I mean, from a purely psychological standpoint, it's fascinating. Does that kind of enforced isolation break someone like Bilancia? Or does it just feed into their already distorted worldview?
That's a really good question. And what's interesting is that the video mentions reports from prison that paint him as a model inmate. Quiet, cooperative, almost like a shadow of his former self. Which, honestly, is kind of unsettling in its own way. It's like the monster has just retreated deeper inside.
Right. It makes you wonder if this was genuine change or just another form of manipulation. Was he trying to game the system? Or was there some actual remorse buried beneath that quiet exterior?
It's impossible to know for sure, isn't it? Although there is that mention of him expressing remorse, writing letters of apology to the families of his victims. But how could they, or any of us, ever truly know if those feelings were genuine?
That's a question that hangs over every case like this, I think. Can someone who commits such awful acts ever truly atone for them? And if so, what does that even look like?
It's a question that goes way beyond the legal system, even beyond psychology. It touches on, like, the very essence of good and evil, redemption, forgiveness.
Deep stuff. And, for anyone listening, I think Bilancia's story really raises some profound questions. This isn't just about one man and his crimes. It's about trying to understand the darkness that exists within humanity, period.
I agree. It's a challenge to confront our own assumptions about good and evil, to try and wrap our heads around the complexities of criminal psychology,
Yeah.
and to consider the limits of justice and redemption. Well, we've certainly journeyed through some dark territory with this one, haven't we? The horrific crimes, the troubled past, the possible motivations. It's a story that both fascinates and repulses. It makes us want to find answers while simultaneously reminding us how much we don't and maybe can't understand.
Absolutely. And while we may never fully comprehend what drove him to do what he did, maybe the most valuable thing we can take away from all this is a reminder to be vigilant, to challenge our own assumptions, and to never underestimate the capacity for both darkness and resilience that exists in us all.
So well said. This deep dive has definitely taken us to some dark places, but hopefully it's also sparked some interesting conversations and maybe even a deeper understanding of just how complex the human psyche can be. Thanks for sharing this journey with me, and to everyone listening, remember, the quest for knowledge, even when it leads us into the shadows, is always a journey worth taking.